Hi, folks. Thanks for tuning into another episode of the Philosophy Salon. Tonight, we're going to be resuming a conversation that we've been having seasonally so far as long as the podcast's been running, and that is one that is relevant to the Christmas season. And the particular topic we're going to be talking about tonight is the meaning of Christmas, of course. And it's a topic we've talked about in a previous recording from last year. And we reflected on the meaning of Christmas for the 2021 season last year. So tonight we're going to be continuing with our analysis and reflections upon the meaning of Christmas. And like we did the previous time, we're going to be having a conversation about Dickens' A Christmas Carol in an effort to understand the meaning of Christmas. And in particular, we're going to be philosophically examining the psychological transformations within the Christmas Carol and Scrooge's psychological transformations in particular, and what these transformations might imply about the meaning of Christmas. And sort of our central theses that we're going to be considering are our three important transformations that occur within the Christmas Carol, and we're going to be examining those. And the first of these relates to Scrooge's epistemological orientation to the world. The second relates to changes in Scrooge's socioeconomic orientation. And finally, the last deals with changes in Scrooge's ethical orientation. And in examining these changes in Scrooge's philosophical orientations to the world, we'll be investigating the degree to which these changes can be explained by transformations in Scrooge's personality characteristics, including the Big Five personality characteristics expounded by the five-factor model of personality. And I suppose in the broadest sense, we'll be examining philosophy and its underlying relation to personality. So that's kind of sort of a meta theme in the background of all this discussion. And with respect to all the changes and transformations in Scrooge's philosophical worldview and personality, we'll be asking the central question: what is significant or meaningful about these changes and transformations in relation to Christmas? So in other words, how do these changes and transformations that Scrooge undergoes enable one to find and fulfill the meaning of Christmas? What sort of personal messages can we gather from examining philosophically and psychologically these changes and transformations within Scrooge? So just to briefly touch on the previous discussion we had on the meaning of Christmas last year, last winter we focused on exploring the extent to which the meaning of Christmas is ethical in nature. And it was our contention that the meaning of Christmas is ethical in nature in a twofold sense. The first, to attain, maintain, and improve one's well-being in a eudaimonic and a hedonic sense. And the second is the meaning is ethical to the degree to that it helps us to attain, maintain, and improve one's own well-being for the better through benevolent actions inspired by the Christmas spirit. So the Christmas Carol helps us to come to a realization of these different meanings of Christmas, these ethical meanings. And so tonight we're going to continue on in a similar vein, but our focus to begin with is not going to be primarily ethical, but epistemological. So we'll be covering some new material here. And I first want to examine, in relation to these questions we're asking about Scrooge's changes of philosophy and changes of personality, the first topic I want to investigate is this issue of Scrooge's epistemological orientation to the world and how he transforms his epistemological orientation from a narrow-minded empiricism to an open-minded pluralism. And I want to look at the bearing that these changes have on the question of what is the meaning of Christmas. So just an initial question to consider and ponder is, how does Scrooge's epistemological outlook change? And how does his default way of perceiving the world change? And what transformations in personality can account for this? So to begin with, we'll examine Scrooge's epistemological orientation of the world and how it changes based upon transformations in certain personality characteristics. And my argument is that Scrooge's orientation is initially that of a narrow-minded empiricist. We might call this view one of epistemological monism. As he develops throughout the story, however, this narrow-minded empiricism evolves into a more open-minded pluralism. And these changes in epistemological orientation, I'll contend, can be accounted for by transformations in his personality, by a decrease in closedness and by an increase in openness. So just for...
Sorry, Graham. I just
yes.
want to, for some of the listeners, they might not know the difference between, when we talk about monism versus pluralism, especially sort of in the epistemological sense. So do we want to kind of flesh that out a little bit? What's the difference between a monist view and a pluralist view?
Yeah, sure. So for people who aren't familiar with the technical vocabulary, pluralism generally is the view that there are, just as the word, plural, suggests many. So with regards to epistemology, epistemological pluralism would suggest, there are many ways of knowing, or at least several ways of knowing beyond just a single way of knowing. And monism would be considered the opposite of that there's just one central way of knowing and no other valid ways of knowing. So that's sort of the sense that I'm trying to get at in using those words.
I think a good illustration of the difference would be through, I think it's Thomas Nagel's Mary argument, the all-knowing color scientist.
Okay.
If Mary can know what it is like to see red before leaving sort of her confinement, where she only sees, shades of gray, then it seems to suggest that there's, other facts in the world beyond just physical facts. So there's a plurality of types of facts that we can know.
Right.
So I think that is maybe a good way of sort of teasing it apart. There's people who view the world as simply material, and there's only one way of understanding that, and other people maybe have a different ontology or metaphysics that allows for different ways of knowing.
Right, exactly. And so that's precisely the sense that we'll be comparing and contrasting these different ways of knowing. And before we get into all of that too, another preliminary definition to be clear upon for also individuals who are somewhat new to philosophy is epistemology, which is comes from the ancient Greek episteme. In ancient Greek means knowledge, and logos means explanation. So in this context, we're seeking to examine the defining features of Scrooge's knowledge and the substantive conditions or sources of his knowledge, and the limits of his knowledge and justification. So with all those preliminary definitions in mind, I want to briefly analyze and examine Scrooge's default way of knowing, what I'm calling his narrow-minded empiricism. So from the outset of the novel to the visitation by Marley's ghost, the reader of the Christmas Carol will note certain defining characteristics of Scrooge's knowledge based upon his default way of perceiving and knowing the world. In particular, his way of knowing appears to be empirical in nature, that is, based upon experience. And indeed, we might say that Scrooge's way of knowing is based upon a rigid and narrow-minded empiricism, insofar as it excludes other ways of knowing beyond his merely observable sensory experiences. So, Ryan, I know you had some thoughts on that formulation of rigid empiricism. Was there anything you wanted to add there? That's okay.
So it seems like, he's very much confined to his own experience of the world, and you can kind of see this in his approach. His approach to the world and his views of other people. And I think you can see this in his sort of lack of theory of mind when he can't understand, why people are happy.
Mhm.
Sorry, I lose my voice. One sec.
Sorry.
Yeah, so he doesn't really understand why people who are less fortunate than him could be happy or jolly, over the holidays. If he can't, be happy or jolly, then why could people less fortunate than him do so? And I think that really sort of shows how he's confined to his own experience and his own way of understanding the world.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a valid point. I think that his lack of theory of mind perhaps keeps him isolated from others um, and perhaps being able to sympathize and empathize with others and to relate to others, to be receptive to others, and sort of the knowledge that they can impart.
I think too, like that rigid, narrow empiricism sort of implies a bit of sort of skepticism when it comes to the mental state of others. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're a rigid empiricist, like you can't really know what other people think or feel per se, you know? So I think that is a way that that empiricism is tied to his lack of theory of mind. He has a hard time putting himself in the shoes of other people.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that seems to be an obstacle to him empathizing with others. And I suppose that cuts him off through sort of knowledge that would be gained through interpersonal interactions. And so that's an interesting point. Um, it's definitely something to consider in more depth at some point. So just to continue, Scrooge's rigid empiricism has as a natural corollary disbelief in anything irrational or supernatural. So this would include Marley and the three spirits of Christmas that also visit him. And it also includes a dogmatic belief in things that are only material and visibly perceivable in nature. So it would seem that Scrooge is also a rigid materialist in that sense as well. So to continue, we've looked at Scrooge's narrow-minded empiricism and its character. Now I want to consider some personality factors that are underlying his narrow-minded empiricism. And one of those that is perhaps central and salient from my point of view is what personality researchers call closedness, or closedness to experience. So we just might want to raise the question, what is closedness to experience? And closedness to experience is a personality trait characterized by a tendency to be conventional and traditional in one's worldview and behavior. Those who are closed in this way prefer the familiarity of routine instead of the novelty of experience, and typically have narrower perspectives and sets of interests. So in the case of Scrooge's epistemological orientation, his closedness manifests itself most clearly in his narrow-minded empiricism in the sense that we've defined it. So to make sense of this trait, why it manifests in Scrooge's behavior, we might want to consider more deeply its nature. And according to a psychoanalytic interpretation, insofar as we're trying to understand this psychologically, a psychoanalytic interpretation might suggest that Scrooge is so close to experience because his closedness serves a psychological function, and we might argue that it's a defense mechanism, and that's just to say an unconscious psychological process that protects him against thoughts and feelings that evoke anxiety related to his internal conflicts and to stressors in his life. And Ryan, I know you had some thoughts here about the nature of this defense mechanism, and so I'll allow you to elaborate a little bit on its nature before we get into it more deeply.
Which one here? Are you talking about closedness or just resistance in general?
Well, just this remark you had in mind about resistance to memories.
Oh yes, yeah, yeah. So Scrooge, like, especially when it comes to, uh, uh his sister, um, it seems like these are sort of repressed memories of sort of childhood and childhood traumas, and later on, even with earlier on with Marley, just these memories of relationships, and these sort of repressed memories, they still seem to exert like an influence on Scrooge, even though that he's like repressed them out of his consciousness. It still affects his personality, and the way he relates to other people currently. And this is like Freud's concept of transference. So
Okay.
we sort of treat people, here and now based off of the relationships that we had previously. So we may react to someone doing something in a way that doesn't really fit the situation because
Right.
of past traumas. It's sort of like PTSD in a way.
Right.
And this also would affect his epistemological stance as well.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't initially considered repression and transference, but they definitely enrich this idea that Scrooge's closedness is a defense mechanism that protects him from certain feelings of anxiety and other stresses that he's trying to ignore. And it could very well, repression and transference could very well impact his way of knowing and limit his way of knowing. And so that's something we could potentially return to, but I think that it's a very valid point you brought up. And I think that it's an entirely plausible addition we could consider in trying to explain his epistemological stance from a psychoanalytic perspective. So to sort of delve into this a bit more deeply then, in considering the nature of Scrooge's defense mechanisms, one based on my own analysis was that Scrooge's narrow-minded empiricism is a form of resistance, and resistance is one of the central defense mechanisms within psychoanalytic theory. So Scrooge basically disbelieves the reality of Marley's ghost on the basis of an empirical rationalization. So he summarily dismisses the ghost's reality. He explains it away as the effects of indigestion. So a psychoanalytic analysis, in accordance with Freud's theory of defense mechanisms, would suggest that Scrooge exhibits the defense mechanism referred to as resistance. And that's to say a person's tendency to reject, deny, or otherwise oppose what one experiences for the sake of one's own self-protection. And Ryan, you had a thought that kind of elaborates and clarifies this point.
Yeah, I think you pretty much touched on it. I mean, this defense mechanism, can sort of motivate us to rationalize certain experiences, like Scrooge's encounter with the spirits or with Marley's ghost. If it doesn't fit sort of with our epistemological framework, some sort of experience, we try to explain it and rationalize it and make it fit into that framework. Or sometimes we just deny that the experience ever happened. Like we just say, like, oh no, that didn't happen. So I think you can work some more of Freud's concepts into this analysis. So that's sort of what I've done here, is just went through my old notes on Freud.
Well, there's certainly lighting up the analysis, that's for sure. So appreciate those comments thus far. Definitely highlighting aspects of the analysis that I hadn't considered yet. So we could just flag that. Maybe we can come back to that later on. But to continue, so how is this defense mechanism of a resistance? How is this exemplified in the story? Well, in one instance, Scrooge feels threatened when his narrow-minded empirical way of perceiving the world is threatened by the supernatural intrusions he experiences in the form, first of Marley's ghost, and subsequently the three Christmas spirits. So, for instance, he's roused to great fear when he perceives the apparition of Marley's ghost in his doorknob and hearing the clanking sounds inside of his home. So we might, take this as kind of a textbook example of hyperarousal. And as a result, he closes and double locks his door, and he reverts to childlike coping behavior. So he looks under his bed, and he looks at each individual piece of furniture in his room to ensure the absence of any malicious ghosts. So here, resistance manifests itself most overtly as an attempt to physically close himself off from apparently threatening supernatural forces to ensure his protection. So he's very hypervigilant in this manner. So his resistance also manifests itself more subtly as a rejection of his own perception, his perception of Marley's ghost, as well as a rejection of the ghost's effort to intercede on behalf of Scrooge's moral betterment. And he resists the truth of what he senses, he resists the truth of what his senses are delivering to him until he finally gives in and confronts the ghost, asking him, "Who are you?" He continues to resist his senses, summarily and humorously, claiming that the ghost is nothing but a hallucination induced by indigestion. So, he famously says, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than a grave of you, whatever you are." And then the narrator of the story affirms the reason for his resistance. And the narrator says, "The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. So in other words, Scrooge resorts to the humorous use of puns to deny the reality of his perception of the ghost and to shift his attention away from the overwhelming terror he is currently experiencing in its presence. Thus, he is protecting himself from the intrusions of terror penetrating the core of his being. This tendency to reject the reality of the ghost, moreover, illustrates his closedness insofar as his epistemological perspective is narrow-mindedly empirical. It denies the reality of anything in the realm of that cannot be explained by the physical and chemical processes within science, and of a reality that is typically unseen by the eye, such as the supernatural realm of ghosts and spirits. This rigid empiricism has, as a natural corollary, a disbelief in anything irrational or supernatural. So Marley, the three spirits. Marley, in response to Scrooge's disbelief, charges him with willful ignorance, which could be viewed as another manifestation of his resistance and of his closedness more generally. So briefly, willful ignorance occurs when an individual realizes at some level of consciousness, at least, that their beliefs are probably false, or it occurs when they refuse to attend to information that would establish that their beliefs are false. So we might want to ask the question, what beliefs of Scrooge's are probably false? Well, within the metaphysical universe of the story, his belief that only empirically observable, verifiable, and quantifiable things exist, and his belief that only material things exist would appear to be false, because clearly we see within the metaphysical universe of this story ontological commitment to the existence of ghosts and spirits. So Scrooge's beliefs would not seem to be true in that sense, to reflect that spiritual reality we see being portrayed in the story. And what information does Scrooge fail to attend to? Well, he refuses to believe that the ghosts and the spirits that he sees before him are there. He fails to attend to them. And even by his own empirical standards, that seems to be not consistent. So it would seem that they're real even by his own empirical standards, because he can see them, but he's not attending to them. And he also fails to attend to the information derived from his memory and his imagination prior to the visitations of the ghosts of Christmas. And memory and imagination are also valuable sources of knowledge, in addition to just the bare sensory experiences.
Yeah, that really sparked an interesting thought in me. Just give me a second here. It seems like, Scrooge is refusing to sort of conceive of his experiences with the ghosts and the spirits as real, and that sort of epistemological barrier for Scrooge seems to block him from deriving anything meaningful from the experiences. So, like, again, I've said this a couple of times, like, whether or not ghosts are real or whatever, if you believe real experiences, you can take them and actually derive something useful or meaningful from them. But if you just deny and repress, like, it will bubble up for sure, like through your, unconscious or subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, you can't really use them, like, consciously, to better your life and to move you in sort of like a forward direction. So yeah, I think his shift eventually from sort of this willful ignorance to believing in some sense that the ghosts and the spirits are real, that's what eventually lets him derive meaning and joy out of his life.
Right. So the ghosts becoming open and receptive to the influence of the supernatural, of the influence of Marley, and of the influence of the three Christmas spirits helps Scrooge to discover the meaning in his life that he's hitherto not been able to realize. And I think that's a pretty interesting point. I feel like the ghosts are perhaps the agents that allow that realization within Scrooge, without their influence, without being open and receptive to their influence. He's not, without the influence of those ghosts and being receptive to their influence, he's not able to fully realize the meaning in his life and the meaning of Christmas, which is we'll return to. But yes, that's a valid point, and it raises some interesting questions we can maybe return to.
I think that gets into the next section, anyways.
Yes. So on that note, let's get into the next section. So, basically, we see in Scrooge's psychological transformation, in his personality transformation, we see a transformation from closedness to experience to openness to experience. And Scrooge's resistance breaks down almost entirely as he begins to fully acknowledge the perceived reality of the ghost before him. That's Marley. And in his attempt to communicate with Marley, or Marley's ghost. So he says to the ghost, "Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" So opening up his senses to the world and the information that they deliver, and by letting go of his default mode of perceiving the world in a narrow-minded empirical way, allows Scrooge to take the first step in his moral redemption. This initial confrontation with Marley's ghost has thus catalyzed an important change in Scrooge's personality, a shift away from closedness to experience and a movement towards openness to experience. So what is openness to experience then? Openness to experience is a personality trait characterized by various facets. And those that most manifest most clearly in Scrooge are his increasing active imagination, his attentiveness to his inner feelings, and his intellectual curiosity. Through the agency of the three ghosts or spirits, Scrooge becomes increasingly open to experience. So with the first encounter with the ghost of Christmas past, for instance, we see an increasing openness to his past memories, which his resisting tendencies have perhaps previously shut him off from. And we also see an openness to re-experience his past memories as they are revealed to him by the ghosts as imaginal visions. Perhaps the ghosts are symbolic representations of Scrooge's own mind that assist him in the process of active imagination, or perhaps they are real, which seems to be suggested by the metaphysical account of reality provided by Marley. Although Scrooge demonstrates a degree of resistance and closedness after the visitation of Marley, his tendency to resist and close himself off from his experience continually diminishes. For example, Scrooge attempts to snuff out the illumination above the ghost of Christmas past's head, which might underscore his lack of openness. And if you recall from the story, the ghost of Christmas past has this bright, clear jet of light radiating from the crown of its head. And the light, I think, could maybe represent moral illumination or insight. And Scrooge is still yet too closed to be open and receptive to that insight. But by the time the second ghost arrives, the ghost of Christmas present, Scrooge is no longer resistant, but he's ready to confront the ghost. And Scrooge even allows himself to be mysteriously transported to the streets of London on Christmas morning, when the ghosts invites him. So, Ryan, you had an insight here that you wanted to touch upon.
Stuff. Yeah. So when I read through the novella and read through your notes, like this part really reminded me of, I think it's Quine's web of belief. So you kind of see Scrooge eventually, like, over like throughout his experiences, counter enough conflicting evidence to cause enough, cognitive dissonance that he has to revise like the core principles of that form his web of belief, in order to make sense of and account for, the mounting experiences that his previous framework couldn't account for. So, as he, reaches his experience with Christmas Present, I think he sort of reached that threshold of having too much conflicting evidence and cognitive dissonance that he can't rationalize it
Right.
away anymore.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
That makes
I did
sense.
have a question from the previous section that just came up. When we talk about Scrooge's moral redemption, if you think about it from a developmental perspective, which do you think comes first? Like, do you think we develop sort of our moral temperament for our, epistemological stance on the world, like how we understand or how we gain knowledge, or do you think it's the other way around?
Right. That's a valid point you bring up. What comes first, our ethical orientation to the world or our epistemological orientation? I think, you know, on a deep level, I think ethics and epistemology are in some sense interact and interpenetrate with one another. I think for the purposes of our analysis and discussion that it's useful to divide these different orientations up as separate orientations, like his epistemological orientation, his socioeconomic orientation, his ethical orientation. But I think as it will probably become clear as we go along that there are significant overlaps between these different orientations.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a moral dimension to epistemology. I think in order to know the good, to know what is right, to know what is wrong, to cultivate virtue, to become a more virtuous person, I think all of this requires, in some sense, being open and receptive to learning what is good, learning what is virtuous. I don't think that our ethical being can develop and manifest itself without that sort of openness to what our senses and what our faculties and what our intuition, what our memory, what our imagination can reveal to us. So I think in that sense, there's a fundamental interplay between epistemology and ethics. I think ethics also can influence our epistemology. I think, for example, having cultivated, say, certain virtues, like certain intellectual virtues, so perhaps cultivating intelligence, cultivating wisdom, cultivating temperance, all of these things will affect our epistemology insofar as they will maybe make us better epistemological agents. Like they'll assist us in our goal to know more and to understand more, because we'll have those virtues that enable us to learn better, and to absorb information and to, integrate what we learn and apply it and that sort of thing.
I think, like, when I think of the interplay, like, I think of, kids growing up. I think that, at first, children are just taught how to behave in the world. So they're taught, what to do, when to do it, that sort of thing. Where to go to the bathroom, how to eat. So I think generally moral temperament is developed before, someone develops a actual conscious, epistemological stance, or not even conscious, but just like an epistemological stance to the world.
Sure.
Um, but I think when we're talking about redemption, I think you kind of have to work the other way. Like, you have to sort of challenge that epistemological stance
Okay.
before you're able to go back down and sort of attack that moral temperament. So,
Right.
in a way, I think, growing up, our moral temperament, which is, determined by our personality, our physiology, and how that relates to our environment. I think that moral temperament is developed first and forms sort of the basis for our epistemological stances, metaphysical stances, all that kind of stuff. But in order to, uh, you know, revamp our moral temperament or orientation, I think we need to drill back through all of that stuff. The epistemological, the metaphysical. Sort of to be able to change that. In a way, the moral temperament can kind of be seen as, the core of the web of belief.
Okay.
When we talk, I mean, the core of the core. Like, obviously, metaphysics and epistemology is pretty core to our web of belief, but like at the very center, I think sort of that moral temperament or that ethical sort of orientation is at the center. But yeah, I was curious because, like, it's interesting that you can sort of change someone's ethics by changing the way that they understand the world or, gain knowledge of the world.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I'd be curious to understand what you mean uh, about as to what this ethical core is. Um, we can do you have that sort of a notion of what that ethical core is, like, and how that
Yeah.
affects
Well,
our
like,
way
if
of
you're
knowing?
someone who's like a utility, it's going to imply certain metaphysics. It's going to imply that you can know certain things about the world,
Okay.
right? Like, if you're a utilitarian, let's just take a very basic form of it, like act utilitarianism. You assume that you can more or less measure, goodness or like utility, positive
Okay.
outcomes, right? There's certain things implied by sort of a moral framework, So
Okay.
in a way, your sort of moral compass or ethical orientation will determine your epistemology because it tells you how you ought to gain knowledge about the world,
Right.
right? In a way, epistemology, what you decide on your epistemological stance is a moral decision, right?
Okay.
It's sort of like it's moral in a sense. It's like, how should I go about gaining knowledge of the world?
Right. Okay. That makes more sense to me now. So I suppose your ethical core, in some sense, is your ethical presuppositions about the world. That things can be measured, for instance. That happiness can be measured and quantified, and so therefore that's going to impact your epistemology insofar as you're going to consider things to be true if they are in fact measurable, quantifiable.
Mm.
So yes, that makes sense to me.
Like, if you're a utilitarian and you're trying to maximize utility, you think, well, how do I best do that? What ought I do to figure out how to best maximize utility? So maybe you decide to take a scientific, approach, right? Take measurements, count the variables, make small adjustments here and there to see what the effects of these variables are. So like your moral framework kind of decides like how you look at the world,
Right.
metaphysically and, epistemologically. So
Right.
again, like if you're a utilitarian, you're probably going to take a scientific point of view
Right.
because you think that these things can be measured, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yes, no, I think that's a valid point. I think the both your ethical orientation and your epistemological orientation, I think there's an interplay there. There's reciprocal interaction. What comes first, what comes second, I'm not entirely clear on right now myself. So that's something I need to work through on my own. But I think it's definitely a question worth pursuing in some more depth.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry. So I kind of went back. The point that you were just addressing was the one about him no longer being resistant but ready to confront the ghost, and
yes,
regarding the Christmas present, correct?
that's correct.
Okay, yeah. So that was just talking about the web of belief, and okay, so
That's right.
we did cover that. Okay, good.
Yes. Yes. So, to continue, Scrooge's resistances are wearing down, and he's moving from resistance to responsibility. And Scrooge's moral development uh, starts to become uh, clearly manifest in the final stave. And in the final stave, Scrooge's again doesn't resist the final visitation of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And indeed, he seems to take responsibility for the rest of his journey. He's able to name the ghost and to predict what the ghost's predict that the ghost's visitation is there for his own moral betterment. And Ryan, you had some comments you wanted to flesh out here regarding this point.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Just continuing with the psychoanalytic theme here, I did some research on Freud's concept of denial. So there's different ways of using denial to avoid personal responsibility. So there's blaming, minimizing, justifying, and regression.
Okay.
Um, I think they're pretty straightforward. So like blaming is just like a direct statement shifting culpability. Uh, so it may also involve like denying facts. This never happened, that kind of thing. The minimizing is just making an attempt, or yeah, an attempt to make the effects or results of an action appear to be less harmful than they actually are. So sort of just like trivializing, a pain that you've caused somebody.
Okay.
Justifying, so when someone takes a choice and attempts to make that choice appear acceptable due to their perception of what is right in a situation. So like if you do something, and even if you chose a reasonable course of actions given the information you had at the time, you might try to avoid responsibility for harm that you've caused by basically saying like, well, I didn't know. I thought this was the right decision. It's like, well, that doesn't negate the pain that you've caused, right? You're still
Right.
responsible for it. It might not be as bad, but you're still responsible for it. And the final one's progression. So when someone acts in a way unbecoming of their age, so that period there that you read about him checking under the bed,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So I was just sort of wondering if we could sort of just off top of our head come up with some examples. So there's the regression one, when he's in the his room, checking
Right.
underneath things, like trying to sort of like sort of deny what's going on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, these are interesting points. Just trying to think of examples.
I think he minimizes a lot, like he sort of minimizes the struggles of other people, and the
Right.
situations they find themselves in. Like he really sort of is dismissive
Right.
of the struggles of other people, and I think he maybe does some justifying with Marley,
Right.
like in his debates back and forth about like, what the right thing to do is, and talking about business.
Right.
I think there's some justifying there. I think the regression we already went through,
Right.
blaming, I'm not so sure about that. Like the only thing that kind of comes to mind is his talk about surplus populations, and like, aren't there, prisons or whatever, for these people. So like,
Right.
you know,
Right.
not really seeing his culpability in the situation that other people find themselves in, like that
Right.
he might be causing the plight of other people.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think these are definitely valid points you bring up. And I think these forms of denial are most characteristic of Scrooge at the earlier stages of the story before he develops uh, from who he is at the start to who he is, uh, towards the later stages of the story. But I think these forms of denial definitely help to make sense of Scrooge's perhaps his closeness, his tendency to um, deny um, certain insights, certain forms of knowledge, and denial is yet another way I think in which this closedness is manifesting itself. Uh, to continue, I want to briefly touch upon uh, Scrooge's transformational rebirth, and with respect to his epistemological worldview and the personality transformations that are underlying it. And Scrooge basically, um, after being, visited by the final ghost, Scrooge is reborn into a new being, and his newly found happiness. Uh, uh, so yes, he's transformed into a new being. So he's newly found happiness, and he's filled with giddiness and relief for having been granted a second chance to redeem himself. And he pledges that he will live simultaneously in the past, the present, and the future, although he does not fully comprehend how a mere mortal such as he could do such a thing. And basically, what Scrooge is regaining is what we might call the eternal perspective. So Scrooge is recovering his innocence by rediscovering the eternal perspective wherein he abides in the past, the present, and the future temporal frames simultaneously. And philosophers have a term that describes this perspective. The Latin for it is subspecies Aeternitatis. And subspecies Aeternitatis is a Latin term that translates as under the aspect of eternity. And the use of the term traces back most notably to Baruch Spinoza and has been used by eminent philosophers since then. And it is a mode of living in which one sees their own situation as well as the situation of others from all temporal points of view. And John Rawls said something to that effect, the political philosopher John Rawls, of all people. So, question that I'd like to ask is, well, first of all, Ryan, I think you had a point you wanted to make about this concept of subspecies Aeternitatis. I think you had you had a quote you wanted to touch on.
Yeah, not so much a point, but just an illustration of other philosophers kind of getting at the same point. So my favorite philosopher for many years has been Nietzsche. And he says in some letters home to his sister and his mother that I love New Year's Eve and birthdays, for they allow us hours, which admittedly we can often create for ourselves, but seldom do, in which the soul can stand still and review a phase of its own development. Crucial resolutions are born in such moments. For a few moments, one is raised above time and almost steps outside of one's own development. One secures and documents the past and receives the courage and resoluteness to resume traveling along one's path. So here you can kind of see all those, all three elements. He
Yep.
talks about being raised above time, so that's the present, and stepping outside your own development, and you're able to secure sort of the documents and events of the past and take that and with courage and resoluteness continue on into the future, with new goals and resolutions in mind.
Right. That's a great quote, and I think that helps to um, shed light on what this eternal perspective involves. This embracing of the past and the present and the future all at once. And it would seem that for Nietzsche, in some sense, it's sort of a temporary standing outside of uh, linear time
Mm.
and being able to kind of reflect upon all time frames of sort of
In a
a
in a way, like this is what people mean by like eternal and like timelessness.
right,
You're just sort of like you can sort of see everything all at once. It's
right,
like it's not like time passing. It's just like one big moment, and it's all sort of wrapped up in, history, what happened before, like seconds before, minutes before, you know,
right,
and like I've had experiences where I feel like that's how I'm living, where, you're so in the moment and you can see where you've come from and sort of direct, it feels like you're directing things, into
right,
the future in whichever way that you want. And you do it with
right,
like this joyfulness and like this like creative zest.
right, right. Yeah, you see sort of into the nature of things, I suppose, how the past has affected the present, how perhaps the present is going to affect the future. I suppose, assuming this perspective, gives us gives us an ability to conduct ourselves more effectively in life. It gives us maybe an omniscience, um, having access to all these temporal points of view at once gives us an omniscience. Um,
I
you know,
think too that, just in general, we have those three parts of ourselves. We have that part of ourselves that was, past, the way that we were when we were teenagers and kids. We have who we are now as adults. And we have sort of that dream, which may, part of it still may be left over from when we were teenagers, or young adults. But being able to see all three parts of yourself, helps you understand, why you are where you are right now and why it is that you set the goals that you did for yourself for the future. Like, I was just discussing this when I was, um, you know, 16 or so. I set out this idea of, success and the way that I wanted to live my life and for, the way I wanted my life to turn out. But, at some point you need to take that moment and pause and think, where am I going and why am I going in that direction? And that involves looking into the past,
right,
in the values that you had and the ideas that you had and reassessing those. So I think being able to, incorporate your past and understand that it is directing you into the future is a really vital part of understanding yourself and ultimately mastering yourself into where you want to be in life.
Right. Yeah, no, the past continues to exert an influence on the present. Um,
And the way
the
we view it too, right? Like
yeah,
there's the past and then there's the way that we decide to interpret it, personally.
right. And then there's the future, and the future in some sense, from the present perspective, it's not here yet. We're just in the present. As I talk into this microphone, it just doesn't seem like there's anything above and beyond this present moment we're having, this conversation we're having. But there is a foreseeable future, a possible future, and that also exerts an influence on us as well. We have certain, say, goals ahead of us that we want to achieve within certain time frames, and that's usually in the future. And we can envision a state of affairs that we want to achieve in the future. We have sort of a visualization. We can visualize where we want to be in our imagination, sort of that ideal state, that ideal version of ourselves, that ideal life that we're striving towards. And it would seem that the future exerts an influence on the present in that sense, in the sense that our own imaginations of the possible future impact our attitudes and behavior in the present. So
I'm
it
just
does seem
thinking
like,
about this in the way of a diagram. So like, I don't know which way is which for you on your screen, but like,
right,
let's say this is past and this is future, and then in the middle is present. The past affects the present, right? And
right,
the future in a way also affects the present because of the goals that you're aiming towards,
right,
right? And then also the past affects the present or the future in the sense that you set your goals for the future in the past,
right,
right? And also the future affects the past because what you accomplish in the future will also affect how you interpret the past. So it's sort of like this, three blocks with lines going into the middle and arrows going, each way. So it's sort of like this
right,
like reciprocal, like symbiotic relationship
right.
of,
Yeah.
past, present, future.
There's this triadic relationship between all of the temporal frames, and they're all mutually affecting and constraining each other. That's interesting. This almost lends itself to an entire conversation on, the philosophy of time and time perspectives and how they impact us, our behavior, our attitudes. Definitely something I'd like to come back to and revisit.
Did you take the metaphysics class with oh geez, I can't remember his name, the nerdy guy with the
Uh,
glasses?
there was Patrick Rishu.
No, the other. He's like younger with glasses, like very nerdy, geeky looking,
Oh,
younger.
um, Mike Raven, I believe.
Raven, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
Raven, yeah. I took
yeah, I know.
metaphysics with him and did the like, what is that? The metaphysics of time, where it's like
Okay,
a temporal like sausage.
right. Interesting. Well, that would be, he might be an interesting character to have on the podcast to talk about the philosophy of time with. Or we could just talk about it independently. But either way, it's something that I think it would be fruitful to revisit and to talk about at some length. But in the meantime, let's continue talking about our analysis of the Christmas Carol and Scrooge's changes in epistemological worldview and the personality traits underlying that transformation. And we're nearing the end of the discussion on this segment of this podcast. And I think in wrapping up discussion, one question I wanted just to put forward that we can mull over and talk about briefly is, based on our discussion thus far of Scrooge's changes in epistemological outlook and personality, so his decrease in closedness and his increase in openness, what conclusions maybe draw about the meaning of Christmas So, Ryan, do you want to maybe chime in first, and then I can offer my own reflections?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my thoughts are pretty much half baked here, but you know, I see sort of the meaning of Christmas, through the Christmas Carol as sort of a reminder, going into the new year and into the future to remain open to new experiences, to
Right,
remain open to new ways of viewing the world and to viewing uh, new ways of viewing others and your relationships to others.
right,
Um, I think it's a time for reflection and challenging yourself and um, perhaps enriching your life with meaning through a worldview that is in some sense kind of foreign to our current milieu in the Western world of more or less materialist metaphysics and sort of empiricist epistemology.
hmm,
So I think it's a good time to kind of open yourself up to more of these spiritual experiences, and by spiritual I mean like things like feeling connected with others. Not
right,
like necessarily supernatural or religious
right,
spiritual, but just having sort of those special experiences, with other people that you don't often make time to have in your regular everyday life.
right. Yeah, no, I think those are definitely valid reasons for uh, valid reasons that support the importance and meaning of Christmas. Um, my own take on this is that we can find meaning, during the Christmas season through committing to a process of change, much like Scrooge does in the Christmas Carol. And this process of change is moving from a more vicious person to a more virtuous person. And in this context in particular, the vices we're seeking to um, diminish and reduce are those of closedness. It would seem, based on the the lessons and messages that I've gotten from this reading of the Christmas Carol, that closedness shuts you off from other ways of knowing. It shuts you off from other things within the world that perhaps if you were receptive to could offer you information, insight, meaning. For example, Marley and the spirits. Now, whether or not they're real or whether or not they are manifestations, symbolic manifestations of our personality, or they're part of the collective unconscious, they're archetypes or something, that's an open question. But I feel like definitely reducing the vice of closedness and promoting the growth of the virtue of um, openness, openness to those ways of knowing, the uh, memory, imagination, um, intuition, um, visionary experiences, and so on. All of these things can amplify our knowledge of the world, expand our knowledge of the world. And if we fully internalize that knowledge, we become, I think, wiser people in the end. And, with respect to the Christmas season in particular, I think that being less closed and more open during the Christmas season allows us to be more receptive to um, more receptive to the moral imperatives of the season. Being benevolent to others, uh, fulfilling your moral obligations to others. Um, these these moral imperatives perhaps might be not fully accessible or cut off from you if you're not fully open to that to them, and fully open to, I suppose, your moral intuitions and your moral senses, which I think are just as real as your sense of sight, your sense of smell, your sense of hearing. I think perhaps we have a moral sense, and it's there trying to inform us, to provide us with knowledge as to what we ought to do, what we should do, who we should be. And insofar as we're closed to the messages that our moral senses can deliver to us, we're promoting virtue or we're promoting vice rather than virtue. But by being open to the messages that moral sense can communicate, we're promoting openness, and we're promoting our moral development. We're promoting the Christmas spirit within us. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think, in general, the way that society is set up, like it's a hyper competitive culture, right? Like we're always competing with one another for jobs, for attention on social media, or whatever it is. We're always sort of like competing. Whether it's in the sexual or relationship marketplace, like especially with the internet, everything is very sort of competitive. And I think Christmas is much to what you just said about becoming a more virtuous person. It reminds us that it gives us a break from that mentality that our society sort of instills in us about being competitive, and especially with capitalism, and I'm sure back then with the sort of laissez-faire capitalism they had, running somebody over for your own gain, throwing someone under the bus for your own gain was, people didn't give it a second thought. So I think this Christmas spirit, just Christmas in general, is maybe somewhat of a counterbalance to the way that our culture has gone here in sort of the Anglo-Saxon, Western culture. I think it is a bit of a reminder about our humanity and what it is in life that gives us meaning and purpose. And that's our connections with other people, relationships with our family, our friends, and the person at the coffee shop, or your coworker or your employee or whatever.
Yes, well said. And you can't be connected if you're not open and receptive to others. So I think that underscores the importance of openness over closedness. And so I think we've touched upon some interesting and relevant points on the meaning of Christmas in relation to these epistemological changes and corresponding changes in Scrooge's personality. Shift maybe from more of an rigid empiricism to a open-minded pluralism, in which not just the sensory experience is a path to knowledge, but also additional sources, imagination, memory, intuition, maybe even other entities that are perhaps not detectable by the visible eye, but might nonetheless be there. So we analyzed and examined those changes and transformations within Scrooge, and we've sort of arrived at some provisional understanding of all of this suggests about the meaning of Christmas. So in our next conversation, we're going to be continuing this thread, and we're going to be examining and analyzing changes within Scrooge's socioeconomic philosophy and the personality changes underlying Scrooge's change in socioeconomic philosophy, and what that might imply about the meaning of Christmas. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, we'll sign off for now, and we'll leave you to ponder what these epistemological and personality changes might suggest about the meaning of Christmas. So bye for now, and stay tuned for the next episode.